I'm sitting with David Waldron. David is a company director of CloudStrong and a certified data protection practitioner. GDPR is coming into effect on May the 25th. Can you tell us a bit about what is GDPR and how is it going to affect small to medium enterprises?
Sure. GDPR is a means of protecting the individual, i.e. the subject, in terms of all personal information and personal data that's held within a business. So May 25th is the cut-off deadline when the GDPR compliance measures need to be enforced for all businesses, whether you're a sole trader, SME or enterprise. So it's really about protecting the personal and sensitive data that any business holds within their central file repository or whatever systems they have in place. So the 25th of May should be seen as a starting line as opposed to a finishing line, simply because it is here to stay. It's a European-wide initiative and all businesses, large and small, will have the same compliance measures that they're going to have to adhere to. So it's a case really of assessing what personal data, what sensitive data you have in possession, what's the lawful and legitimate purposes, why you're processing it, and what are the measures you have in place to best secure that personal data.
So May 25th is a deadline to get going, but most likely there isn't going to be huge penalties at that date. It is law, but it's an ongoing process, is that right?
It's an ongoing process, but people have to understand that data protection measures are in place as we stand right now. So for all data protection and supervisory authorities throughout Europe, there are data protection laws in place. This is a European-wide initiative. Again, it's a representative body that everyone has a full understanding as to what the new compliance measures are and how they need to adhere to best practices in order to protect the individual's rights and freedoms for any information, to ensure that they're not in breach or any information gets into the public domain. So in terms of the core principles of GDPR, there are 8 principles in total. So firstly, you need to ensure that you obtain and process information fairly. So any personal data that comes into your possession, you have to ensure that that data is accurate, it's safe and secure. In terms of processing it, you have to make sure that you're processing it in only ways compatible with the purpose for which it was gathered in the first place. You have to ensure that it's adequate, relevant, and not excessive, and only retain it for as long as necessary. And data minimization is key to GDPR to ensure that if any personal data or sensitive personal data within your possession within the business does not exceed what would be deemed to be fair. And also to ensure that you can provide a copy of any personal data or sensitive personal data that resides in your systems should a subject require to get a full copy of it. In other words, a subject access request. If that comes into the business, that you have a clear policy in place to provide all the said information that you retain on that individual. And that's really a guideline of the core GDPR principles in question.
What would you see as the best first steps to take for small, medium enterprises in becoming GDPR compliant?
Okay, so first and foremost, there is no GDPR certification, and that's very important for businesses to understand. However, in saying that, GDPR is all around accountability. So accountability for the business owner or company that is in possession of that personal or sensitive data. So in terms of the best next steps, really you need to sit down and assess what personal data resides within the business, and understanding if you are a data controller or if you're a data processor, or indeed if you are both. So a data controller is the individual or company or business that manipulates or edits or collects that personal data in the first instance. In terms of a data processor, it could be an outsourced or third party, whereby they're under the direction of the data controller to perform tasks according to the data controller's clear lines of guidelines as to how they process that said data. I suppose really and truly you need to perform a checklist, and that checklist has to adhere to the 8 core GDPR principles that are outlined in terms of having it accurate, up to date, retain the data no longer than necessary, and assess what areas of the business is collecting this personal data. Why are you collecting that personal data? What's the legitimate reason behind it? Is it in the interests of the individual? Is it excessive? Is it fair? And thereafter you'll get a good, clear understanding as to what type of personal data you're holding and maybe where there may be vulnerabilities in the business also. So really and truly, if you outline a clear personal data flow map, for want of terms, you will quickly understand what data is in your possession and what areas within the business you need to work on to improve security or the authenticity for the reasons behind holding that said personal data.
So does every business need a data protection officer, or is it just for small business or large businesses?
A good question. This is something that a lot of SMEs have been asking, and really and truly it's a case of sitting down and assessing what type of personal data you have, the volume of that said personal data. So under the GDPR regulations, typically you could be talking for 250 employees plus, or if you are processing high volumes of personal or sensitive personal data. So really it's a question of sitting down and understanding the personal data that is being processed within the business or the company at this moment in time, and thereafter you will know if you need a data protection officer or not.
So do I have to be worried as at a startup level?
Any business needs to be concerned when it comes to the protection of personal data. I suppose the advice that I could give you really is in terms of the best first steps. So you are a startup, you have a website, and you may have an order form within that website, or you may collect some data. Maybe it might be a name, email address, company name. So personal data, first and foremost, is any data that can directly or indirectly identify an individual. So if you're collecting name, address, telephone number, company name, those in turn are all personal data that identifies an individual. Really what you need to do is have a privacy statement on your website and a cookie policy on your website. So it's clear and transparent and unambiguous as to the personal data that you're collecting, so that the individual in question fully knows and it's transparent as to why you're collecting that personal data. And once you have those steps in place, along with your own internal employee policies and procedures and processes for processing that said personal data that may be transmitted directly from the website to your internal systems, then you're in a good place. Again, it's going back to the 8 core GDPR principles. So understanding why it is that you're collecting that said personal data. Is there a legitimate and lawful reason? Is it accurate, up to date? And is it secure? So again, from a website perspective, would you have SSL certification? Do you have the cookie policy? Do you have your privacy statement? So these are all key steps to have in place to ensure that you're adequately protecting the personal data that is transmitted via your website.
Is there a difference between personal data and sensitive data in GDPR?
Good question. I suppose first and foremost, it's important to understand what personal data is. And personal data is any piece of data information that can directly or indirectly identify an individual, so i.e. the subject. So for example, David Waldron may or may not be seen as personal data because there may be hundreds or indeed thousands of David Waldrons in Ireland or worldwide. However, my email address, david.waldron@cloudstrong.ie, clearly identifies me, and I work within CloudStrong, so that is a piece of personal data. In the same way, you have a passport number, it could be a driving license, it could be a car registration number, your mobile number or your home address, and these are all key pieces of personal data. When it comes to sensitive information or sensitive personal data, this is under a special category under GDPR, and it really revolves around information. It could be due to race, ethnic origin, it could be health, It could be biometrics, so for example, a time management system within a business where people have to submit a fingerprint scan upon entry, genetics, or politics or religion. So these are all categories that would be under the heading of sensitive personal information. So you really need to understand this, and in turn you need explicit consent for holding and processing that said information.
So how would a business protect itself against a data breach?
So first and foremost, all SMEs need to adequately protect all information such as personal data and sensitive personal data within the business to ensure that there was no loss of data or theft of that said data, really to ensure that the rights and freedom of the individuals are not affected. So in terms of how a business would ensure or at least mitigate against the risk of a potential data breach, really and truly they would have to compile a vulnerability assessment within the business to see how exactly is that said data secured at the moment. Is there more adequate measures that could be put in place? Is it a case that all employees fully understand the policies and procedures and processes in place to best protect that said data? So really it's a case of sitting down, assessing how the data is being collected, how is it being secured, do all employees within the business fully understand the processes and procedures involved, and it's a case then of risk mitigation. So maybe adding extra layers of security. It could be ensuring that all software is up to date. It could be a case of ensuring that there is a password management policy in place, or ensuring that there is the required firewall protection in place. So really it's a case of singling out any potential area that may carry a risk associated with it. And once you have that vulnerability assessment complete, you will be able to add extra layers of security to best protect against a breach.
And having an action plan in place that can be done swiftly.
Exactly, an action plan or a simple checklist to say that, yes, I have fully stood over and are accountable for all potential areas that may be vulnerable, or there may be a weak link in the system. And again, that may be not from a technology perspective, it may be from a business perspective in terms of the employees not fully understanding the rules and regulations around the protection of personal data. And it may be just a case of people having a different mindset when it comes to personal data and the protection of it. So employees are key because internal incidents can often be a major risk as opposed to outside threats in terms of maybe ransomware or outside hackers. So it's important that all employees fully understand the risks involved.
What is cybersecurity and how can it help my business with GDPR?
Sure. I suppose at a high level, cybersecurity is information technology security. So in terms of GDPR and how cybersecurity can benefit a business to protect personal data, again, it's really around adhering to the core principles. So first and foremost, ensuring that if you have an e-commerce website, that it is hosted on a secure platform, it has an SSL certification implemented, and really ensuring then that you have a privacy statement on the website, a cookie policy, and clearly outlines how that said personal data is being collected and what's being achieved with the personal data once it's been processed. Aside from that, really and truly, it's a case of understanding the technical measures that are in place to best protect that personal data. So if it's a case that you need a firewall, or you need the latest security patch, or you need any third-party antivirus software included, all these steps all co-align with GDPR and cybersecurity measures that you need to put in place as best practice, and also to ensure that you comply with GDPR.
I think it's in the best interest of both the business and the consumer to have this in place, and also to speak in plain English in order to get your message across so that the consumer is comfortable.
Exactly, and again, it's going down to education and awareness. So from an end user perspective, for them to be educated to fully understand that if they see the SSL security icon on the top left-hand side of the browser, that they know and understand that they're within a secure site for transacting payments such as your credit card details, debit card details, etc. And really, I suppose from an end user perspective, again, to have the means to know and fully understand what is a legitimate site and what is a legitimate purchase, as opposed to a site that may be spoofing maybe a large brand name or otherwise. So again, it's going back to awareness and education.
Okay, well, thank you, David. David, I just want to thank you on behalf of the eCommerce Association for taking the time out today and giving this information. I'm certainly more in tune with GDPR now. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niall.